The chamber went silent the moment the words left my mouth. I had not planned to say them. I had not even fully understood what I was agreeing to. But there was no taking it back now, and every eye in that vast circular hall, human and otherwise, was fixed on me. My name is Daniel Voss, and 3 months earlier I had been nothing more than a junior attaché assigned to the smallest desk in Earth's diplomatic office on Visara Station. I answered messages. I filed reports. I was not supposed to speak during council sessions. I was supposed to sit quietly behind Ambassador Laura Finch and take notes while she handled matters far above my understanding. But Laura had been called away that morning, pulled into an emergency session on a trade dispute 3 decks below, and she had left me with a single instruction: sit still, say nothing, represent Earth by being invisible. I had failed spectacularly. The council chamber was built for 100 different species, each seated according to rank and standing, each surrounded by translation fields that hummed faintly in the air. Earth's seat was near the outer ring, close to the doors, a placement everyone understood to mean we were tolerated rather than respected. We had been part of the wider galactic community for less than 9 years. To the species around us, some of whom had fleets older than our written language, we were children who had wandered into an adult conversation. The Dravani delegation sat near the center, in the seats reserved for empires with real weight. Their ambassador, a tall being named Threx, had presence in a way I still find difficult to describe. His skin shifted color slightly with his mood, a deep bronze that darkened when he was pleased with himself. He was pleased with himself often. The Dravani Empire had spent the last 2 centuries expanding through this section of the galaxy, absorbing smaller species into what they called their protective sphere. Most of those species had not been asked whether they wanted protecting. The Council tolerated this because the Dravani were careful. They followed the letter of Council law even while ignoring its spirit, and they had never lost a challenge of sovereignty in living memory. That morning, Threx rose to address a matter concerning a system on the edge of Dravani territory, a system with rich mineral deposits that Earth had quietly begun colonizing 8 months earlier. We had followed every regulation. We had filed every claim. The system was empty, unclaimed, and legally ours the moment our survey ships planted the first beacon. Threx did not see it that way. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes about ancestral claims, about historical proximity, about the Dravani Empire's long-standing interest in that region of space. None of it was technically false, none of it mattered under Council law, but then he did something that made the entire chamber go still. He invoked the challenge of sovereignty. I did not fully understand what that meant at the time. I knew the words. I had read them in a briefing document once, in a section I had skimmed because it seemed irrelevant to my work. A challenge of sovereignty was an ancient council mechanism, older than most member species, that allowed one party to formally contest another's claim to territory through direct confrontation rather than endless arbitration. It was rarely used. It was even more rarely accepted because refusing simply meant a return to standard negotiation, while accepting meant something far more permanent. Threx was not truly expecting a contest. He was expecting Earth to fold, to walk away from the system rather than risk confrontation with an empire that had never lost one of these challenges. It was theater, a show of strength meant to remind everyone watching that the Dravani Empire did not need to justify itself to newcomers. The chamber's presiding officer, a quiet, ancient being called an arbiter, turned toward Earth's empty ambassador seat. Under Council protocol, someone representing Earth needed to respond within the session, or the challenge would be recorded as accepted by default. A technicality almost no one remembered existed because no delegation was ever foolish enough to leave a challenge unanswered, by choice or by accident. I looked around for Laura. She was not there. I looked for anyone senior enough to step in. There was no one. The silence stretched, and I felt every second of it pressing down on my chest. I stood up. I do not fully know why. Perhaps it was the way Threx smiled while he spoke, as though the outcome had already been decided and the rest of us were simply here to watch him confirm it. Perhaps it was some instinct buried deep in me that refused to let that system go without a word being said in its defense. Perhaps it was simple, foolish pride. Whatever it was, I spoke, and the translation field carried my voice across the chamber before I could stop myself. Earth accepts the challenge. For a long moment, nothing happened. Threx blinked, his bronze skin flickering with something that might have been surprise. The Arbiter tilted its head slightly, an unreadable gesture in a species with no expressive face to speak of. Then the murmuring began, spreading outward from the center of the chamber like ripples across still water, dozens of species leaning toward their neighbors, translation fields overlapping into a low, indistinct hum of 100 languages, all asking some version of the same question. Did the human just accept? I felt my pulse in my throat. I had no authority to accept anything on Earth's behalf. I was not the ambassador. I was not even a senior attaché. But under Council law, once a challenge was accepted in open session by any recognized member of a delegation, it was binding. There was no walking it back. There was no quiet correction later. The words were spoken, recorded, and sealed into the Council's official record the instant the translation field carried them. Threx recovered his composure quickly, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, a calculation being made and settled. He inclined his head toward me with exaggerated courtesy. "Then the matter is decided," he said. "The challenge of sovereignty stands. Terms will be arranged through standard protocol." He sat down. The Arbiter made a note in the air before it, a gesture that activated some recording system I could not see. And just like that, it was done. Earth was now formally bound to a challenge of sovereignty against one of the oldest, most powerful empires in this section of the galaxy, and the person who had accepted on our behalf was a 26-year-old junior attaché who had, until 10 minutes earlier, never spoken a single word in open council session. I do not remember sitting back down. I remember the seat feeling too small, the room feeling too large, and the weight of 100 sets of eyes still resting on me, even as the session moved to its next item of business, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. It was the being seated beside me who broke through the fog first. Her name was Ulmor, an elder from a species called the Senethi, small and pale, with soft folds of skin along her jaw that moved slightly when she spoke. She had served on the council longer than I had been alive. She leaned toward me, her voice pitched low enough that the translation field barely caught it. "Do you understand what you have just done, young one?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. I genuinely did not know how to answer that question, because I did not yet understand it myself. Ulmor did not wait for a response. She simply studied my face for a long moment, her expression somewhere between pity and something else I could not name, something closer to concern for a person who had just stepped off a ledge without realizing the ground was so far below. "You have accepted a challenge of sovereignty from the Dravani Empire," she said quietly, "on behalf of your entire species, without authorization, without preparation, without even understanding the terms." "I know what the words mean," I said, though my voice came out thinner than I intended. "Do you?" she said. It was not really a question. Around us, the session continued as though the ground had not just shifted beneath my feet. Delegates from a dozen species discussed trade routes and resource allocations in the same measured tones they always used, but I noticed something now that I had not noticed before. Small groups leaning together, glances thrown in Earth's direction, then quickly away. A ripple of attention that had not existed 30 minutes earlier. Threx, for his part, looked thoroughly pleased with himself. He spoke with the delegates near him in low, satisfied tones, occasionally glancing toward our section of the chamber with an expression I can only describe as anticipation. He believed, I think, that he had just secured an easy and public victory, one that would remind the newer species in this council exactly where they stood in the order of things. I did not yet understand why some of the older delegations were not smiling the same way. I caught sight of the Arbiter watching me with what I could only interpret as quiet curiosity, an ancient being who had presided over council sessions since long before my grandparents were born, watching a young human who had just done something no one in this chamber had expected. I could not tell if it was concern in that gaze or something closer to fascination, as though it were watching the opening move of a game it had seen played before, long ago, under very different circumstances. The session ended nearly an hour later, though I could not have told you a single thing that was discussed after the challenge was accepted. My mind kept circling back to those words, spoken without thought, without authority, and now permanently sealed into council record. Earth accepts the challenge. As the chamber began to empty, delegates rising from their seats in the slow, orderly fashion the council always maintained, Ulmor remained beside me. She did not rise immediately. She watched the Dravani delegation file out, watched Threx pause at the doorway to exchange a final satisfied glance with his aides, and only once he was gone did she turn back to me. "You should contact your ambassador immediately," she said, "before she hears of this from someone else." I already knew that. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for my communicator, and I realized only then how badly I wanted someone, anyone, to tell me that this could still be undone, that there was some clause, some technicality, some way to walk it back. Ulmor's next words extinguished that hope before I could even voice it. "There is no undoing a formal acceptance, young one," she said, her voice gentle but certain. "Whatever comes next, your people are bound to it now. I only hope, for your sake and theirs, that you understand what you have set in motion." I did not understand, not yet, but something in the careful, measured way she spoke, something in the quiet dread behind her pale eyes, told me that whatever was coming would be far larger than a dispute over a mineral-rich system on the edge of Dravani space. I lifted my communicator and called Laura Finch, and as it connected, I found myself staring across the emptying chamber toward the seats where Threx and his delegation had been sitting only minutes before, still pleased, still certain, still utterly unaware of what they had just done. Laura Finch arrived at my office 11 minutes after I called her, and I have never seen a person move that quickly through a station corridor while still maintaining the appearance of calm. She closed the door behind her, looked at me for a long moment, and then asked me to repeat exactly what I had said in the chamber, word for word. I told her. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable in the way I had come to associate with the best diplomats, the ones who had learned to hide their reactions behind decades of practice. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You accepted a challenge of sovereignty," she finally said. "I know," I said. "I am sorry. I did not know what else to say." She shook her head slowly, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. "Do not apologize yet," she said. "I need to understand what we are dealing with before either of us decides how to feel about it." Over the next several hours, my small office became the center of a growing storm. Laura contacted the council archive and pulled every record of a challenge of sovereignty that had ever been formally accepted, which turned out to be a shorter list than either of us expected. The mechanism was ancient, dating back to the earliest days of the council, when disputes between founding species were settled through direct confrontation rather than endless committee review. Over the centuries, as more species joined and the council's bureaucracy grew, the challenge had fallen out of common use, replaced by arbitration boards and trade tribunals and diplomatic mediation. But it had never been removed from council law. It still carried full legal weight, and the Dravani Empire, it turned out, had used it 17 times over the past 2 centuries, winning every single confrontation, each time against a smaller species that had made the mistake of colonizing territory the Dravani decided they wanted. Laura read through the historical records with a growing stillness that worried me more than shouting would have. Each case followed a similar pattern. A newer species would establish a colony or claim near Dravani territory. The Dravani would issue a challenge. The smaller species, lacking any real military capability, would either withdraw their claim immediately or attempt to contest the challenge and lose badly, resulting in the loss of far more than the original disputed territory. "We are not those species," Laura said quietly, almost to herself, "but I do not think Threx understands that yet." I asked her what she meant. She did not answer directly. Instead, she opened a channel to Earth, routing it through the Council's diplomatic relay, and asked to speak with someone at the Ministry of Defense. I remember feeling a cold weight settle in my stomach at that request, the first time it truly occurred to me that this was not simply a diplomatic embarrassment I had caused. It was something that could end in actual confrontation, and I had no idea what that would mean for the people living in that newly claimed system, people who had moved there in good faith, believing Earth's diplomatic protections would keep them safe. While we waited for the connection to Earth to establish, word of what had happened in the chamber began spreading through the station. I noticed it first, in small ways. Delegates from other species, who had never acknowledged my existence before, now looked at me directly as I passed them in the corridors. Some looked away quickly, as though uncertain whether contact with me might somehow draw unwanted attention. Others studied me with open curiosity, the way one might study a person who had just done something remarkably foolish or remarkably bold, and had not yet learned which. Ulmore found me again that evening, in the quiet observation lounge near the diplomatic quarters, where I had gone to try and clear my head. She sat down across from me without asking, which I had learned by then was simply her way. "The other delegations are talking," she said. "Word travels quickly here. What are they saying?" I asked. She considered the question for a moment, before answering. "Some believe you were reckless. Some believe you were foolish. A few believe you may have doomed your species to a costly and humiliating defeat that will set human standing in this council back for a generation." I felt my stomach tighten further at that, though I had expected nothing less. "But a smaller number," she continued, "are saying something different." I looked at her, waiting. "They are saying that Threx made a mistake," she said. "Not you." I did not understand. I told her so. Ulmore folded her thin hands together and studied me for a long moment, before she spoke again, choosing her words with obvious care. "You must understand something about your species, young one," she said. "Earth has only been part of this council for 9 years. In that time, you have made very few friends and very few enemies, because most of the older species have not paid you much attention at all. You are new. You are small in numbers compared to empires like the Dravani. Most delegations assumed you would remain quiet, cautious, easily overlooked, exactly as you were meant to be today, sitting silently while your ambassador handled matters that concerned you." She paused. "But there are some among us," she continued, "who remember the reports from your first years of contact, before Earth formally joined this council, before diplomatic relations were fully established." I felt a chill at that, though I could not immediately place why. I had studied the general history of Earth's first contact in school, the same version every human child learned, a story of careful diplomacy and gradual trust-building between our species and the wider galactic community. It had always been framed as a peaceful, if cautious, process. "There is a difference," Ulmore said quietly, as though reading the thought directly from my face, "between the version of events your species tells itself and the version that exists in certain older council archives, records kept by species who observed your early encounters from a distance before your world was ever invited to join us." I asked her what she meant, my voice tighter than I intended. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped even lower, as though she were sharing something she was not entirely certain she should. "There was an incident," she said, 11 years before your formal admission to the council. A survey vessel belonging to a minor trading consortium made contact with an Earth vessel near the edge of your solar system, without authorization, without proper protocol. The consortium believed, based on your primitive technology readings, that your species would be an easy target for resource extraction. Your planet had not yet developed the defensive capabilities the Council later observed. By every measure available to them, it should have been a simple, uneventful operation. "What happened?" I asked, though some part of me already sensed I would not like the answer. "The consortium vessel did not return," Ulmor said simply. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over in my mind. I had never heard this story before, not in any history class, not in any diplomatic briefing. If it was true, it was not something Earth had ever chosen to publicize, and I began to understand, with a slow and uncomfortable clarity, that there might be a reason for that silence. "That is not something you will find in your own species' public records," Ulmor said, watching my expression carefully. "Your government has been remarkably disciplined about controlling that narrative, but it exists in the archives of at least 3 other species who observed the aftermath from a distance. And it is part of why, when your species formally applied for council membership 2 years later, several of the older delegations voted in favor of admission far more quickly than is typical, not out of trust, out of caution." I did not know what to say. The chamber, the challenge, the entire weight of what I had done that morning suddenly felt different, reshaped by information I had not possessed an hour earlier. "Are you saying Earth has done something like this before?" I asked carefully. "That we have a history of responding to threats with force?" Ulmor tilted her head slightly, a gesture I had come to recognize as her version of careful consideration. "I am saying," she said, "that your species has a documented pattern of behavior that many of the older council members find deeply unsettling, precisely because it does not match the caution and restraint you display in formal diplomatic settings. You are polite here, you are careful here, you follow our laws, attend our sessions, respect our procedures, but beneath that, several of us believe, is a species that has simply chosen, so far, not to demonstrate what it is truly capable of." She leaned back slightly. "Threx is young, by Dravani standards," she continued. "His empire has enjoyed 2 centuries of uncontested victories against smaller, weaker species who had no real capacity to resist a formal challenge. He sees your species through that same lens. New, small in numbers, untested in open conflict. He believes he is repeating a pattern he has executed successfully 17 times before. But you do not believe that," I said. "I do not know what to believe," Ulmor admitted. "No one truly does, because your species has never been tested this way, not since you joined the council, not in any way that has forced you to reveal what you are actually capable of when your interests are directly threatened. That is what frightens some of us. Not certainty that Threx has made a mistake. Uncertainty about what will happen if he has." The conversation stayed with me long after Ulmor left the lounge that evening, and it was still turning over in my mind hours later when Laura finally returned from her extended communication with Earth's Ministry of Defense. Her expression had changed since I last saw her. The careful diplomatic stillness was still there, but underneath it, I thought I could see something else now, something that might have been quiet resolve. "Earth has decided how to respond," she told me. I asked her what that meant. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she sat down across from me, folded her hands together much the way Ulmor had, and studied me for a long moment before speaking. "It means," she said, "that in approximately 6 days, representatives of the Dravani Empire are going to discover that they made a very serious miscalculation. And I suspect, based on everything I have read in the historical record today, that we are about to learn a great deal more about our own species than most of us ever expected to know." I asked her if she was afraid. She considered the question honestly, which I appreciated, rather than offering the reassuring answer a lesser diplomat might have given. "I am not afraid of what Earth will do," she said finally. "I am afraid of what the rest of this council will think of us once they see it." Outside the observation lounge window, the slow rotation of Visara Station carried the stars past in a steady, indifferent arc, and somewhere among the thousands of delegates and attaches and diplomats aboard that station, word of what had happened in the chamber that morning continued to spread, carried from one species to another in hushed, uncertain tones, each retelling adding a little more weight to a story that had not yet even reached its true beginning. 3 days after the challenge was accepted, I was summoned back to Earth for the first time since my posting began. Laura arranged the transport herself, and though she did not explain exactly why my presence was required, I suspected it had something to do with being the person who had started all of this. I spent the journey turning that thought over more times than I could count, wondering what waited for me when I arrived, whether I would be reprimanded, reassigned, or simply forgotten in the much larger machinery now grinding into motion. I was not forgotten. If anything, I found myself pulled deeper into the process than I expected. The facility I was brought to sat outside a coastal city, a low, unremarkable complex that gave no outward indication of its purpose. Inside, however, the atmosphere was entirely different from anything I had experienced on Visera Station. There was no ceremony here, no careful diplomatic posturing, no translation fields humming with a dozen overlapping languages. There was simply quiet, focused activity, people moving between rooms with purpose, screens filled with information I did not fully understand, and an overall sense that everyone present had already decided exactly what needed to happen next. I was introduced to a woman named Grace Whitmore, a colonel with Earth's Joint Defense Coordination Office, who greeted me with a firm handshake and an expression that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. "So you are the one who started this," she said. I began to apologize, the same reflexive response I had given everyone since the challenge was accepted, but she cut me off with a small shake of her head. "Do not apologize to me," she said. "You gave us an opening we did not expect to get for years. If anything, you did us a favor." I did not understand what she meant, and I told her so. She gestured for me to follow her, leading me through the facility toward a briefing room where several other officers were already gathered around a central table, displaying a slowly rotating holographic map of the disputed system and the surrounding Dravani territory. She explained, as we walked, that Earth's defense planners had been quietly monitoring Dravani expansion patterns for years, ever since our species first joined the Council and began learning the true shape of galactic power dynamics. "We knew this was coming eventually," she said. "Not this exact situation, but something like it, an empire testing our boundaries, assuming our newness meant weakness. We had contingency plans in place long before you ever stepped into that chamber. What we did not have was justification to act on them without appearing to be the aggressor in the eyes of the wider council. You gave us that justification," she continued. "Threx issued the challenge. He invoked the ancient mechanism. He set the terms in motion under council law, in front of every delegation present, with full legal standing. Whatever happens next, Earth is not the one who escalated this conflict. We are simply responding to a direct challenge, exactly as council law permits." I asked her what Earth intended to do. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she activated the holographic display, expanding it to show not just the disputed system, but the broader region of space surrounding it, dotted with markers I did not recognize, some belonging to Dravani forces, others representing something else entirely. "Most species in this council," she said, "understand conflict through a very particular lens. They have codified rules of engagement, established over centuries of interaction between empires that have learned to fight each other according to shared expectations, formal challenges, declared engagement zones, limits on force proportional to the stakes involved. It is, in its own way, a very civilized approach to violence. Earth does not share that history," she continued. "We spent most of our existence as a species fighting each other, long before we ever encountered another intelligent species among the stars. We do not have centuries of shared galactic tradition shaping how we approach conflict. We have our own history, and it is considerably less restrained." I felt a chill at the calm, matter-of-fact way she said this, the same unsettling quality I had noticed in Ulmore's voice back on the station when she spoke of the incident from Earth's early first contact years. "The Dravani Empire believes it is entering a challenge of sovereignty," Grace continued. A ritualized confrontation with clearly understood limits, the same kind of engagement they have conducted successfully 17 times before. They expect Earth to send a token force, engage under Council-observed conditions, and lose in a manner that reinforces their reputation without requiring excessive commitment on their part. She looked at me directly then, and something in her expression made the room feel colder. "We do not intend to fight that engagement," she said. "We intend to fight a war." I asked her what the difference was, though some part of me already suspected the answer would be significant. "A ritualized engagement has rules," she said. "Both sides know the boundaries in advance. Force is measured, escalation is limited, losses are contained to the immediate engagement zone, and once a victor is declared, both sides withdraw according to Council protocol, with the losing side ceding whatever was originally in dispute. A war has no such boundaries," she continued. "A war continues until one side can no longer continue fighting, or chooses to stop for reasons of its own. There is no predetermined limit on force, no guaranteed containment of the conflict to a single system, no assumption that both sides will observe the same restraint once the engagement begins. Threx believes he has issued a challenge," she said. "We intend to demonstrate to him, and to everyone watching, that Earth does not fully recognize the distinction he assumes exists between the two." I sat with that for a long moment, trying to understand the full weight of what she was describing. "Are we not bound by Council law to observe the terms of the challenge?" I asked. "Will this not simply confirm everything the rest of the Council already fears about our species, that we cannot be trusted to follow the rules everyone else observes?" Grace's expression shifted slightly at that question, something that might have been approval passing briefly across her features. "We will observe the letter of Council law precisely," she said. "Every requirement, every procedural obligation, every formal condition attached to the challenge. We are not interested in breaking the rules. We are interested in demonstrating that the rules do not require the restraint everyone assumes they do. There is a considerable difference between the two, and it is a difference the Dravani Empire has never had reason to consider before, because no species has ever chosen to explore it against them." Over the following days, I remained at the facility, given a low-level security clearance that allowed me to observe, if not fully participate in, the preparations unfolding around me. I watched Earth's response take shape with a growing sense of unease that never quite resolved into either confidence or fear, but hovered somewhere uncomfortably between the two. What struck me most was the absence of anything resembling panic. I had expected, given the scale of what we were facing, some sign of desperation, some visible strain among the people responsible for planning our response to an empire that had never lost a formal challenge in 2 centuries. Instead, I found calm, methodical preparation, conducted with the same unhurried focus I imagined a surgeon might bring to a difficult but familiar procedure. I asked Grace about this one evening, as we reviewed updated fleet deployment schedules together in the quiet hours after most of the facility's staff had gone to rest. "Why does no one here seem afraid?" I asked. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Fear is useful," she said, "when it sharpens your preparation. It becomes a liability when it clouds your judgment. Everyone in this building understands exactly what is at stake. We are not ignoring the danger, we are simply refusing to let it dictate how we think." She gestured toward the display before us, showing the deployment plan for what Earth intended to send in response to the challenge. A force that, I noted with some surprise, appeared far smaller in raw numbers than I had expected, given the stakes involved. "The Dravani Empire measures strength the way most established powers in this council do," she explained. "Ship count, weapons tonnage, fleet mass. By every metric they use to evaluate a potential opponent, our response force will look almost laughably inadequate compared to what they typically deploy for these engagements." "That does not concern you?" I asked. "It concerns me a great deal," she said, "which is precisely why we are not going to fight this the way they expect." She began walking me through the broader strategy, and as she did, I began to understand the shape of what Earth actually intended. Rather than meeting the Dravani fleet in the kind of large-scale, formalized engagement the challenge traditionally called for, Earth's forces were being organized around principles that seemed, to my admittedly limited understanding of galactic military convention, almost deliberately unconventional. Smaller, faster vessels, built for coordination and adaptability rather than raw firepower. Extensive use of deception, feints, and misdirection, tactics that Grace explained were considered somewhat dishonorable by traditional Council military doctrine, which favored direct, declared confrontation between comparable forces. A willingness to strike at logistics and supply lines rather than engaging the Dravani main fleet directly, extending the conflict's true battlefield far beyond the single disputed system where the formal challenge was technically meant to take place. This does not seem like it follows the spirit of the challenge, I said carefully, uncertain how she would respond to the observation. It follows the letter of the challenge precisely, she said. The Council's law defines a challenge of sovereignty as a formal state of contested conflict between two parties over a specific territorial claim, to be resolved through military engagement until one party withdraws or is rendered unable to continue. It does not specify the scale, duration, or methods of that engagement. It does not require both sides to observe equivalent restraint. Those expectations exist only through centuries of unwritten tradition between species who have chosen to fight each other that way. We have made no such agreement, she continued. And Threx never asked us to. I found myself thinking of Ulmore's words back on the station, about the incident from Earth's early history that had quietly shaped how several older Council species viewed our species long before most of us realized it. I began to understand, sitting in that briefing room surrounded by calm, unhurried preparation for a conflict that could reshape Earth's standing in the galaxy forever, that this was not an aberration. It was, perhaps, simply who we had always been, carefully hidden behind 9 years of careful diplomatic restraint. On the 5th day, I stood on an observation platform overlooking the departure of the response fleet, and I understood, for the first time, exactly what Grace had meant when she said Earth did not intend to fight the engagement Threx believed he had arranged. There was no ceremony, no grand address to the assembled crews, no gathered crowds waving farewell, nothing resembling the departure I might have imagined for a fleet embarking on a conflict this consequential. The ships simply moved, one after another, sliding away from the orbital platforms in near total silence, running dark, communications minimized, formations loose and irregular in a way that seemed almost careless, until I noticed, watching more closely, that the apparent disorder actually made it far more difficult to predict their movements or intentions from any distance. Grace stood beside me on the platform, watching the same departure with an expression I could not fully read. "Threx is expecting a fleet," she said quietly, as the last of the ships slipped into the dark beyond the platform's lights. "He is going to get something else entirely." I asked her what she meant. She did not answer directly. Instead, she turned to look at me, and something in her expression, calm, certain, and quietly resolved, told me that whatever answer I was looking for would become clear soon enough, whether I was fully prepared for it or not. "Watch the council chamber closely over the coming days," she said. "I suspect you are about to learn a great deal more about your own species than you expected to know when you accepted that challenge." With that, she turned and walked back toward the facility, leaving me alone on the platform, staring out at the empty space where Earth's response fleet had disappeared into the dark, carrying with it a demonstration that would, in the days to come, ripple far beyond the borders of a single disputed system, reaching every corner of a council that had, until recently, considered humanity little more than a curiosity on the edge of galactic affairs. I returned to Visara Station 2 days later, and the change in atmosphere aboard the station was immediate and impossible to ignore. Where once Earth's delegation had occupied a small, quiet corner of diplomatic attention, now every conversation seemed to circle back, eventually, to what was happening in the disputed system on the edge of Dravani territory. Laura met me at the transport bay, her expression tighter than I had seen it before, though whether from stress or focus I could not immediately tell. "The engagement has begun," she told me, as we walked quickly toward the diplomatic quarters. "Council observers are receiving updates in near real time. You should see this for yourself." We arrived at a secure viewing room reserved for delegation staff, where a large display showed a continuously updating feed of verified reports from Council observation vessels stationed at a legally mandated distance from the conflict zone, close enough to monitor the engagement, far enough to remain uninvolved. Several other members of Earth's delegation were already gathered there, watching in tense silence. The Dravani Empire had deployed exactly what I expected, based on everything Grace had shown me: a large, traditional battle fleet, organized in the disciplined formations that had served them well through 17 previous challenges. Their ships were larger than anything Earth had sent, their weapons more powerful by every conventional measurement, their numbers advantageous enough that any outside observer studying the initial deployment would have assumed the engagement's outcome was already decided. Earth's response force, by comparison, appeared almost absent from the system entirely. I asked Laura where our ships were. She gestured toward a series of faint markers scattered across the display, spread out far beyond the immediate engagement zone the Dravani fleet had settled into, positioned in a pattern that made no immediate sense to me. "They are not where the Dravani expected them to be," she said. Over the following hours, I watched the engagement unfold in a way that bore almost no resemblance to what I imagined a formal challenge of sovereignty was supposed to look like. The Dravani main fleet held its position near the disputed system's primary planet, waiting for Earth's forces to arrive and engage according to the traditional expectations of such a confrontation. They waited a long time. Instead, reports began arriving from scattered points across the wider region. Small, coordinated strikes against Dravani supply convoys, communication relays, and support vessels positioned well outside the formally designated engagement zone. Each strike was brief, precise, and conducted by small groups of fast, heavily coordinated vessels that struck their targets and withdrew before any meaningful response could be organized. "This is not what a challenge of sovereignty typically involves," one of Laura's colleagues said quietly, watching the reports accumulate with an expression somewhere between concern and fascination. "They are attacking targets outside the engagement zone entirely." "The engagement zone was never formally restricted by Council law," Laura said. "Threx assumed it would be, because every previous challenge he has fought followed that convention. He never confirmed it as a binding condition, because it never occurred to him that anyone would question it." I watched the reports continue to accumulate over the following day, and a pattern began to emerge that I found genuinely difficult to reconcile with everything I understood about warfare between established galactic powers. Earth's forces never engaged the Dravani main fleet directly. Instead, they systematically dismantled the infrastructure supporting that fleet, striking supply lines, disabling communication relays, and isolating the massive, powerful, traditionally organized force at the heart of the engagement until it found itself unable to effectively coordinate, resupply, or even reliably communicate with Dravani command. The Dravani fleet, for all its size and firepower, had been built and trained to fight a very particular kind of war, the kind of formal, declared, boundary-respecting engagement that had served the Empire successfully for 2 centuries. It had never been tested against an opponent willing to ignore those boundaries entirely, and the results, even from the sanitized, carefully verified reports reaching the Council observation feeds, made it clear that the Empire was struggling to adapt. 3 days into the engagement, I stood in the Council chamber gallery, watching alongside dozens of other delegates and observers as the Arbiter received a formal update on the conflict's progress, information that had been verified and approved for open session disclosure under Council transparency protocols. The chamber was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Word of the engagement had spread far beyond the delegations directly involved, and species who rarely attended sessions unless required found reasons to be present, drawn by curiosity, concern, or simple disbelief at what the early reports seemed to suggest. Threx sat in his customary seat near the center of the chamber, and I noticed, for the first time since this entire situation began, that his composure had begun to slip. The confident, satisfied bearing he had carried since the challenge was first issued had been replaced by something tighter, more controlled, the visible effort of a person working hard to maintain an appearance that no longer matched the reality unfolding around him. The Arbiter's update was delivered in the same measured, neutral tone it used for every council announcement, but the content of that update sent a fresh ripple of murmuring through the assembled delegates. Dravani forward supply capacity within the engagement region has been reduced by an estimated 60%, the Arbiter reported. Communication coordination between deployed Dravani vessels has been significantly disrupted. The Dravani main fleet remains largely intact, but is reporting difficulty maintaining effective operational cohesion. I glanced toward Ulmor, seated several rows away, and found her already watching me, her expression unreadable, but her attention absolute. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched, with the quiet, focused attention of someone confirming something she had suspected all along. Over the following 2 days, the situation deteriorated further for the Dravani Empire, though deteriorated felt almost too gentle a word for what the reports described. Earth's forces continued their systematic campaign against the fleet's supporting infrastructure, never engaging the main force directly, never offering the kind of decisive, honorable confrontation that Dravani military doctrine had been built around for 2 centuries. Instead, they simply continued dismantling everything that fleet depended on to function, patiently, methodically, until the massive, powerful, traditionally organized force at the center of the engagement found itself effectively stranded, unable to resupply, unable to coordinate, unable to retreat in good order without risking further losses along the way. On the 6th day, Threx requested an emergency session of the council, and I watched, from my seat in the gallery, as the ambassador, who had once radiated such confident superiority, stood before the assembled delegations with an expression that had clearly been carefully composed to hide whatever he was actually feeling underneath. The Dravani Empire wishes to formally withdraw from the current engagement, he announced, and the chamber went utterly silent at those words. Under the terms of council law governing a challenge of sovereignty, we cede the disputed system to Earth's sovereign claim and request the immediate cessation of hostilities across the wider conflict zone. The Arbiter considered the request for a long moment before responding. Earth's delegation has been notified of your withdrawal request, it said. Confirmation of Earth's acceptance is required before hostilities can be formally concluded under Council protocol. All eyes in the chamber turned toward Laura, seated in Earth's designated section, and I watched her rise slowly to address the Arbiter directly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber through the translation field. Earth accepts the Dravani withdrawal, she said, and confirms cessation of hostilities, effective immediately upon formal council recording of this exchange. The Arbiter made the necessary notation, and just like that, 6 days after Threx had issued his confident, dismissive challenge in this same chamber, the conflict was formally concluded. Earth retained full sovereign claim over the disputed system. The Dravani Empire, for the first time in 2 centuries, had lost a challenge of sovereignty, and lost it in a manner so decisive that it had never even come close to a traditional engagement at all. Threx did not linger in the chamber after the formal proceedings concluded. He gathered his delegation and departed quickly, his bronze skin darkened to a shade I had not seen before, one that I suspected, even without fully understanding Dravani expressive biology, was not a color associated with satisfaction. I remained in the gallery long after the session ended, trying to process everything that had happened over the past 6 days, from the reckless words I had spoken without thinking, to the quiet, methodical demonstration of capability that had just reshaped, in a matter of days, the way an entire empire's confidence in its own supremacy would likely be remembered for generations. Ulmor found me there, much as she had found me on that first day, and settled into the seat beside me without asking. "You look troubled," she observed. I told her honestly that I did not fully know what I was feeling. Relief, certainly, that the conflict had concluded without the losses I had feared. But something else too, a growing awareness that the events of the past 6 days had revealed something about my own species that I had never fully understood before. Something that unsettled me, even as it also, in some quieter way, filled me with a complicated kind of pride. Ulmor seemed to understand this without my needing to explain it fully. "You are beginning to understand what the rest of us have suspected for years," she said quietly. "Your species has spent 9 years being careful, being patient, being deliberately unremarkable in the eyes of this council. I think, perhaps, you have simply been waiting for a reason to stop." I did not know how to respond to that. I simply sat beside her in the slowly emptying chamber, watching the last of the delegates file out, and wondering, with a mixture of unease and something I could not quite name, what the rest of the galaxy would make of what had just happened here. The weeks that followed the end of the engagement brought changes to Visara Station that I could not have predicted, even after everything that had already happened. Where once Earth's delegation had occupied a quiet, overlooked corner of council attention, we now found ourselves at the center of a very different kind of scrutiny, one built not from curiosity or mild dismissal, but from something closer to careful, deliberate caution. I noticed it first in the small things. Delegates who had never acknowledged my presence in the corridors now offered polite greetings, careful and measured, the kind extended to someone whose goodwill had suddenly become worth cultivating. Species who had previously ignored Earth's diplomatic requests for minor trade adjustments now responded within days rather than months. Ambassador Laura Finch found her schedule filling rapidly with meeting requests from delegations who, 6 weeks earlier, would not have considered Earth significant enough to warrant a private audience. I asked her about it one evening as we reviewed the growing list of requests together in her office. "They are not doing this because they suddenly respect us," she said, without looking up from the display before her. "They are doing this because they are afraid of what might happen if they do not." I asked her if that distinction actually mattered. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It matters a great deal," she said. "Respect earns cooperation freely given. Fear earns cooperation grudgingly extended, and grudging cooperation has a way of curdling into resentment over time. I would have preferred we arrived at this position through years of demonstrated trustworthiness rather than 6 days of decisive conflict. But I suppose we do not always get to choose how these things unfold. The most significant shift, however, was not in how other delegations treated Earth directly, but in how they began treating each other whenever the subject of humanity arose in conversation. I began hearing second-hand, through Ulmor and a handful of other delegates who had grown comfortable speaking candidly with me, accounts of private discussions happening across the station, conversations that rarely made their way into any formal council record. Several smaller species, I learned, had begun quietly reviewing their own territorial disputes with larger, more established empires, wondering aloud whether a similar approach might prove effective if they ever found themselves facing a challenge they could not otherwise hope to win through conventional means. Ulmor told me, with a note of something between amusement and concern in her voice, that at least 2 minor delegations had approached Earth's diplomatic staff privately, seeking guidance on how such an approach might be structured, questions that Laura had deflected with the same careful diplomatic caution she applied to nearly everything. "We are not interested in becoming a symbol for others to invoke against every larger power they resent," she told me, when I mentioned these approaches to her. "What happened in that engagement was a response to a direct challenge against our sovereignty, not a template for reshaping the entire balance of power in this council." I would prefer people understood the difference. Not everyone was quite so measured in their reaction. I attended a routine session roughly a month after the engagement concluded, seated once again in my accustomed place behind Laura, careful this time to remain exactly as invisible as I had originally been instructed to be on that first fateful day. During a break between agenda items, I overheard a conversation between two delegates from species I did not immediately recognize, seated close enough that the translation field carried their exchange to me, even though they clearly believed themselves out of earshot. One of them, a representative from a smaller trading collective near the outer rim, was expressing frustration over a long-standing dispute with a larger regional power, one that had, for years, quietly pressured the collective into unfavorable trade terms through the persistent threat of territorial expansion. "Perhaps we should simply refuse the next demand outright," the delegate said. "Let them see what happens." The second delegate, older and visibly more cautious, responded with something that struck me deeply, though I do not believe either of them realized I had heard it. "Do not be foolish," the older delegate said. "We are not Earth. We do not have whatever it is they are hiding beneath that careful diplomatic surface. If we refuse, and they respond with force, we will not survive it. Humans, it seems, might." I found myself thinking about that exchange often in the days that followed, turning it over in my mind alongside everything Ulmore had told me about the incident from Earth's early history, and everything Grace Whitmore had explained about the deliberate distinction between a ritualized engagement and an actual war. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing sense of unease, that the true consequence of what had happened was not simply Earth's victory over the Dravani Empire in a single territorial dispute. It was the quiet, permanent shift in how every other species in this council now understood what humanity might be capable of. A shift that would likely shape our relationships with the wider galaxy for generations to come, regardless of how carefully Earth's diplomats tried to manage the fallout. Threx himself vanished from active council sessions for several weeks following the engagement's conclusion, and when he finally reappeared, the change in him was unmistakable. The confident, faintly condescending bearing he had carried through every previous session was gone, replaced by something far more careful, far more measured, the posture of someone who had learned, in the most costly way possible, that his previous assumptions about the galaxy's order had been fundamentally mistaken. He approached Laura directly during a recess, several weeks after his return, and I stood nearby, close enough to hear the exchange, though I made certain to keep a respectful distance. "Ambassador Finch," he said, his tone carrying none of the theatrical confidence I remembered from that first session, "I wish to formally extend the Dravani Empire's respect for Earth's sovereign claim, and to express our interest in establishing a more constructive diplomatic relationship moving forward." Laura accepted this with the same careful, professional grace she brought to nearly every interaction, though I thought I detected the faintest note of something else beneath her measured response, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps simple relief, that the matter, at last, appeared genuinely settled. "Earth welcomes constructive relationships with all council members," she said. "We have no interest in ongoing hostility with the Dravani Empire, provided our sovereignty is respected going forward." Threx inclined his head, and for just a moment, before he composed himself fully, I caught a flicker of something in his expression that I had not expected to see from him. Not resentment, not wounded pride, something closer to genuine unease, the look of a person who had glimpsed, briefly and unwillingly, the true scale of a mistake he had made, and understood that he would likely carry the weight of that lesson for the remainder of his career. "I understand now," he said quietly, more to himself than to Laura, "why the Council's oldest members have always spoken of your species with such particular caution." He departed shortly after, and I did not speak with him again for the remainder of my posting on Visara Station. Nearly 2 months after the engagement concluded, I found myself once again seated in the observation lounge with Ulmore, the same quiet space where she had first told me about the incident from Earth's early history that had shaped so much of my understanding of everything that followed. She had requested the meeting herself this time, which was unusual enough that I arrived uncertain what to expect. "I wish to share something with you," she said, once we were both settled. A new delegation arrived at the station yesterday, representing a species called the Corvath, recently admitted to Provisional Council membership. Their senior envoy requested a private briefing on notable recent events within the council, the kind of orientation typically given to new members to help them understand the current diplomatic landscape. I asked her what that had to do with me. I attended that briefing, she said, and a significant portion of it concerned your species. She described, in careful detail, how the briefing had unfolded, an experienced delegate walking the new Corvath envoy through the recent history of the Council, the balance of power between its major species, the unwritten rules and expectations that governed most interactions between member states. And then, inevitably, the conversation had turned to Earth, and the delegate conducting the briefing had recounted, in hushed, careful tones, the story of a young, newly admitted species that had accepted a challenge of sovereignty from one of the Council's oldest and most powerful empires, and had proceeded to dismantle that empire's confidence so thoroughly that the empire itself had requested an early withdrawal rather than continue an engagement it had once assumed would be effortless. The Corvath envoy asked what lesson she should take from this story. Ulmor told me. The delegate briefing her offered a very simple answer. Never assume you understand what a species is capable of based solely on how new they are to this council, or how carefully they have chosen to present themselves so far. And whatever you do, do not challenge Earth, unless you are entirely certain you understand what you are inviting. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the slow rotation of the stars beyond the lounge window, the same steady, indifferent arc that had carried past this same window on the night everything began, when I had first accepted a challenge I did not fully understand, spoken in a moment of instinct I still could not entirely explain, even months later. "Do you regret it?" Ulmor asked quietly, watching my expression. "What you did that day?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "I do not regret defending our claim," I said finally. "I am not certain I would make the same choice again, given how little I understood in that moment about what I was setting into motion. But I cannot say I regret the outcome, even though I am still uncertain exactly how I feel about what it revealed." Ulmor nodded slowly, as though this answer satisfied something she had been curious about for some time. "That uncertainty," she said, "is perhaps the most human thing about you that I have observed since we met. Your species accomplishes remarkable, sometimes unsettling things, and then spends considerable time afterward wondering whether you ought to feel proud or troubled by what you have done. I do not believe that uncertainty is a weakness, whatever some of the older delegations might privately think. I believe it may be the very thing that keeps your species from becoming something the rest of us would have far more reason to fear." I thought about her words often, in the months that followed, as Earth standing within the Council continued its slow, careful transformation from overlooked newcomer to a species treated with a particular, watchful respect that I suspected would follow us for a very long time. I thought about them whenever I heard, second-hand, another story of some distant dispute quietly resolved because one party invoked, however indirectly, the memory of what had happened between Earth and the Dravani Empire. I thought about them whenever I passed Threx in the corridors of the station, and watched him offer a polite, careful greeting that bore no trace of the confident condescension he had once carried so easily. And I thought about them, most of all, on the quiet evenings when I found myself back in that same observation lounge, watching the stars turn slowly overhead, remembering a young attaché who had stood up in a silent chamber without fully understanding what he was about to set into motion, and wondering, with a complicated mixture of pride and unease that I suspected would never fully resolve itself, exactly what kind of species I truly belonged to, and exactly how much of what we were capable of still remained quietly, carefully hidden, waiting for a reason to be revealed. Somewhere across the galaxy, I imagined. Other delegations were having similar conversations in quiet rooms of their own, weighing old grievances and territorial ambitions against a newly sharpened caution, deciding, one by one, that whatever disputes they carried with them, provoking Earth was no longer a risk worth taking. And in the council chamber itself, where I still sat quietly behind Laura Finch during every session, careful now to remain exactly as unremarkable as I had always been instructed to be, I noticed that Earth's seat near the outer ring had begun to feel, subtly but unmistakably, a little less like the edge of the room, and a little more like a place the rest of the galaxy had learned, at considerable cost to one empire's pride, to watch very closely indeed.